Madrid, winter 1661. Inside the cold stone walls of El Escorial Monastery, the wind howls like a beast clawing at the doors. It's as if nature itself is bracing for the horror about to unfold. The air reeks of incense, sweat, and something sharper, metallic, the scent of royal blood. Behind a heavy oak door, Queen Mariana of Austria is in labor. Her cries pierce the silence, raw, wild, almost inhuman. This isn't just childbirth. It's the scream of a dynasty clinging to survival. Knives flash, towels soak in blood, whispered prayers hang in the thick air. Then, suddenly, silence. The door creaks open. No cheers, no celebration. Just a pale, trembling midwife, her hands stained deep red. She says nothing. She doesn't need to. A child has been born, but not a savior, not a prince. What she holds is silent, still. The baby's tongue protrudes too far from his mouth. His jaw juts out awkwardly, as though carved by mistake. His eyes don't focus. His limbs are limp. There's no resistance in his tiny body, no life, only the appearance of it. And yet, they kneel. The courtiers bow their heads. The priests cross themselves. The maids weep, not from joy, but fear. Because this child, grotesque as he is, carries royal blood. He is an Habsburg. No one dares speak the truth everyone sees. This child isn't an heir. He's an omen, a breathing warning. They used to call it royal blood, as if it were holy, untouchable. But no one said out loud that this blood was also poisoned, twisted in on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. And at the center of this genetic spiral stood Carlos, the boy who didn't come to save the dynasty, but to expose its curse. There were no joyful cries, no victory, only the first act in a long performance of denial. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten tale of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, be sure to like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing we're exploring the past together, across time and space. Long before Carlos ever opened his eyes, if they ever truly focused, the verdict had already been passed. His body was the final link in a long chain of mistakes, repeated religiously for generations. Because in the Habsburg court, love wasn't found outside the palace. It was sought in portraits. For centuries, Europe's most powerful dynasty pursued a single obsession: purity. Not purity of soul, not purity of faith, but blood. A concept dressed in the robes of nobility, hiding a genetic nightmare. They feared the ordinary, rejected the unfamiliar, trusted only their own reflections, as if lineage could be protected by sealing it in a closed loop. And so, the Habsburg family tree didn't grow. It folded in on itself, twisted like a clenched fist of broken bones. Joanna of Austria, a direct ancestor of Carlos, was already a reflection of this inherited deformity. Her portrait, hanging among the golden halls of the palace, looked like a gallery of shattered mirrors. Repeated faces, exaggerated jaws, sunken eyes. The infamous Habsburg jaw wasn't some quaint family quirk. It was a warning sign, a symptom. It told of mouths that couldn't close, tongues that made speech impossible, minds that never fully developed. Behind the marble and gold, the empire was rotting. The inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs had reached levels seen only between siblings in the natural world. But here, it wasn't accident. It was policy. Marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins, brothers and sisters, generations blended into one indistinct mass. A hall of mirrors that reflected nothing but sickness. And in the middle of this twisted logic, Mariana of Austria was born. Not as a woman, as a tool. She wasn't chosen out of love or even diplomacy. She was picked from a genetic chart. She was both niece and wife to King Philip IV. Their shared DNA was greater than that of a father and his daughter. And when Mariana became pregnant, the court rejoiced. An heir, a promise, a future. But the seed was already rotten. Inside Mariana's womb, they weren't crafting a savior. They were stitching together the final warning. From the first months of her pregnancy, the rumors began to murmur behind the tapestries. Extreme nausea, fainting spells, sudden violent mood swings. But they were ignored. The court always ignored what it didn't want to see. Acknowledging an anomaly meant acknowledging a broken system. Then came the birth, and horror took shape. The child was born without a cry. His skin was gray, his limbs were soft. The silence in the room wasn't reverence, it was terror. The royal doctors repeated the lie they'd learned to recite. He's weak, but with God's help, he'll grow strong. The palace accepted it, because the truth was too dangerous to say out loud. Carlos wasn't just a sick child. He was the living proof of centuries of arrogance. The collapse of a dynasty that dared to play God with its own bloodline. A mistake dressed in velvet. And yet, no one dared call it that. Not before the people. Not before the Vatican. Not before the foreign powers waiting for any sign of weakness. So the play began. The stage was built. The backdrops painted. A smile was forced. They dressed him in miniature armor, hung medals from his chest, taught him to hold a scepter, though his hand couldn't grasp it. They placed him on a throne, though his back couldn't support him. They called him His Catholic Majesty, though he couldn't speak a word. From the outside, Spain still looked like an empire, but inside it smelled of confinement, fear, and flesh quietly rotting while everyone looked the other way. In the palace halls, whispers grew louder. Some claimed it was a curse. Others called it divine punishment. But very few dared speak the truth. There were no witches, no demons, just duplicated chromosomes and ancestral pride. Carlos was prophecy made flesh. He had no voice, but his body spoke. Every stumble, every blank stare, every drop of drool down his chin was a reminder. The House of Austria didn't need enemies. It had destroyed itself. From the moment he was born, Carlos wasn't seen as a child, but as a symbol, a fragile emblem propped up by trembling hands, wrapped in hollow promises. The entire empire, vast and decaying, revolved around his broken body, as if fiction alone could hold up reality. His childhood became a carefully choreographed dance of denial. Every missed milestone, every word never spoken, every step never taken, every glance that failed to land, was buried under incense, prayer, and gold leaf. When, at 5 years old, he finally managed to walk, staggering like an old man on the edge of death, it was celebrated like a military conquest. But the palace walls knew the truth. Carlos couldn't eat without choking. His swollen, purplish tongue made it nearly impossible to speak or swallow. Bread became a threat. Meat, a torment. His wet nurses had to wipe his chin constantly as his clothes soaked with drool, his body leaking like a vessel that couldn't hold itself together. Tutor after tutor came and went. None succeeded. Carlos couldn't learn to read. He couldn't memorize prayers. He'd get distracted by the shimmer of a candle or the feel of a cloth stitching. Speak to him, and he wouldn't respond. Scold him, and he'd cry like a baby. Some days, for no reason, he'd scream. High-pitched, piercing cries. He'd bite furniture, hit servants, rage without purpose, without direction, and even that was twisted into virtue. He has a regal temperament, they said. He's contemplative, misunderstood. And so began the grand illusion of the Habsburg court, turning pathology into prophecy. Queen Mariana wove her web of power from the shadows. She ruled in the name of a king who had never reigned. She signed decrees, met with diplomats, read reports that Carlos couldn't begin to understand. She became the eternal regent, hiding behind her son's weakness like a general behind a statue. Portrait artists painted what couldn't be seen. They softened his jaw, brightened his eyes, straightened his spine. In oil, Carlos was majestic. In flesh, barely human. The people, crushed under suffocating taxes and endless hunger, never saw the truth. They saw paintings, parades, holy processions. In them, Carlos was carried like a faded trophy, swaying in his litter, eyes vacant, mouth slack. And still, the nobles clapped. Because the alternative was unthinkable. If Carlos wasn't truly king, if his body wasn't a divine choice but a mistake, then everything collapsed. Then power didn't come from God, it came from chance, and the empire wasn't eternal. It was already dying. So everything became performance. Every royal council, a piece of theater. Every ceremony, a choreographed lie. Ministers bowed to a boy who couldn't understand a word. Masses multiplied. Amulets were distributed. Whispers spread. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, as if magic, not incest, was to blame for his condition. But dark spells couldn't explain the stench from his room, the smell of open sores, of sluggish intestines, of a body that didn't know how to seal itself. His sheets were changed twice daily, not from luxury, but because he couldn't control his bowels. And still, they talked of marriage. Because in that dying court, hope clung to one fragile dream, an heir. If Carlos could father a child, the empire could continue. If not, it had all been for nothing. They chose a wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV, 17 years old, raised in the elegance of Versailles, thrust, without choice, into the arms of a king who looked more corpse than man. Their wedding night played out like a slow-motion tragedy. Some said Carlos cried. Others claimed he prayed. Many whispered he simply sat there, confused, until a servant was brought in to explain what he was supposed to do. There was no consummation, no hope. Doctors paraded through the palace. Tonics, aphrodisiacs, crushed pearls, Spanish fly, animal extracts. Nothing worked, because no potion could fix a bloodline twisted from birth. Carlos was sterile, a king with no seed, an ending with no continuation. Marie-Louise withered beside him. She stopped eating, she stopped smiling. She died at 26, officially from an intestinal blockage, unofficially from despair. Carlos wailed at her coffin, tore out his hair, begged to sleep beside her body, claimed she would return. She never did. A year later, another wife was imported, Maria Anna of Neuburg, strong, German, fertile, at least that's what the propaganda said. She arrived with priests, midwives, and high hopes. The result was the same: nothing. Silence, shame, emptiness. Yet the machinery of monarchy kept turning. Even as the king forgot names, as his flesh dissolved, as he couldn't climb stairs without collapsing, they dressed him every morning. They crowned him. They opened the doors to his throne room. Spain pretended its king still lived. But the only thing that truly breathed was the decaying corpse of the past, propped up by lies, prayers, and a desperate refusal to look into the abyss. By age 30, Carlos was barely a man. He had become a ceremonial object, washed with warm cloths, dressed in brocades he couldn't feel, sat on a throne while his lips whispered names lost to time. The court watched him with a blend of reverence and dread, not for what he was, but for what he represented. Carlos was no longer a king. He was a boundary, a line drawn between what had been and what must come next. Queen Mariana ruled from the shadows. She signed his edicts, controlled who entered his bedroom like a shrine keeper guarding a relic, not out of love, out of necessity. As long as Carlos breathed, enemies couldn't seize the crown. As long as he lived, the illusion could hold. But the illusion was cracking. The air inside the palace had turned thick, not just with the king's rot, but with tension. Any day could be the last, and with his death, chaos would follow. Everyone knew it. No one said it. French and Austrian ambassadors eyed each other in the corridors. Advisors whispered in Latin. Letters flew, sealed with urgency. What was at stake wasn't just one man's life. It was the inheritance of an entire continent. Carlos had written wills, several, all conflicting, each one shaped by the pressures of the moment, sometimes favoring France, sometimes Austria. Meanwhile, the kingdoms held their breath. No matter who he chose as heir, war was inevitable, and while diplomats argued over borders and bloodlines, the king was dying, slowly, relentlessly, his lungs filled with fluid. His feet swelled like infected tree trunks. His urine reeked of metal. His skin shifted in color week by week. But nothing was more haunting than his eyes. Once blank, now distant, as if they no longer looked outward, only backward, as if they remembered what he never truly lived. Masses were held, litanies chanted, relics placed in his trembling hands, but nothing changed. His body gave no sign, his soul gave no answer. Silence filled the room, and silence now was a sentence. The royal physicians no longer spoke of cures, only containment. They fed him with spoons like a baby, changed his robes 3 times a day. His bones had become so brittle, the lightest pressure could snap them. He slept with his eyes half open, as though even death was hesitant to look him in the face. But still, he didn't die. That was his final reign, the reign of waiting. A monarchy of breathless pauses, of faltering heartbeats, of time suspended. The entire court waited with him, as if the ticking of history itself depended on his next breath. Beyond the palace walls, the people had stopped asking. No more parades, no more cheers, only whispers that the king was already dead, that his soul had fled long ago, that his body was moved like a puppet. Some prayed, some mocked, most simply endured. But the empire pretended. Paintings still showed a vigorous monarch draped in gold. Official letters spoke of wise decisions, of piety and strength. Chroniclers praised his holiness. The truth was simpler and crueler. Carlos II was dissolving, body and mind. His brain failed in episodes. His heart beat like it dragged stones. His thoughts came and went like mist through broken, stained glass. But no one could touch the crown. No one dared mention succession, because doing so meant war. And so his body became the battlefield, not between armies, but between stories. Between those who wanted him gone and those who needed him to survive just a little longer. Between those who used him as a shield and those who needed him as an excuse. Without knowing, Carlos had become the final stronghold of a system that no longer had purpose. The last breath of an idea that could only be upheld by ritual, not reality. And still, the lie held. Each morning, the same ritual. Wash him, dress him, prop him up, recite the schedule he couldn't comprehend. He would whisper half words, sometimes a name, sometimes a plea. The court would watch, not for meaning, but for signs he was still breathing. Queen Mariana clung to routine. She ruled from behind curtains, signed decrees, controlled who saw him, not for love, but for control. Because as long as Carlos lived, no rival could seize the throne. But the palace had become unbearable. Not from the stench, they'd grown used to that, but from the tension. The ever-thickening awareness that the end was near. No one spoke it. Everyone knew it. When the final decline began, there were no omens, no torn skies, no divine visions, only silence. The same silence that had blanketed El Escorial the day he was born. Carlos had reached 38, but his body was that of an old man, discarded by time. He weighed barely over 40 kilos. His eyes, clouded by cataracts, searched hallways for faces that had long since died. He mumbled names from the grave, spoke broken prayers. His legs no longer held him. His breath reeked of rot. His skin tore at the touch of bedsheets. And still, he breathed. The doctors, priests, and ambassadors all felt the countdown, but none could predict the final moment. His body, now a relic, refused to let go. And while he clung to life, the world waited to erupt. Because as long as Carlos lived, Europe held its weapons. But once he was gone, nothing would stop the flood. The will was drafted and redrafted in secret. Advisors debated in hushed voices. Who would Carlos choose to inherit a ghost empire? France demanded Louis XIV's grandson. Austria insisted on another Habsburg. England and the Dutch Republic lurked, ready to pounce. As the continent simmered, the king withered, grain by grain, like a cursed hourglass. Maria Anna, loyal to the end, continued her part. She signed royal orders, manipulated envoys, hosted secret meetings. But her face betrayed the erosion. She had aged alongside her husband, not from affection, but from exposure to the same rot. The people, however, no longer played along. Their blind faith in the crown had crumbled under the weight of famine, taxes, and lies. The bells still rang on feast days, but the plazas were empty. The king's image no longer inspired awe, only pity. In his final days, Carlos's mind collapsed completely. He confused his wife for his mother, believed his long-dead brother still lived, asked for maps of lands no longer his. Even the most devout couldn't pretend anymore. The reign had ended long before the death. He became a ceremonial shell, dressed seated, spoken to, but no longer listening, no longer there. He sobbed without knowing why, called out to forgotten saints, flinched from holy water, shook uncontrollably. He left no children, no rightful heir, only a vacuum that threatened to swallow Europe whole. When death finally came, it was in the early hours, no witnesses, no last words, just a rattle beneath a shroud, beneath a ceiling that had heard it rehearsed for decades. His death wasn't an end. It was a release. Release for a body that never asked to be born. Release for an empire begging for a sign to fall. Release for a Europe ready to burn. But also the beginning of something worse. Because where myths die, battles begin for the remains. Carlos II died alone, surrounded by incense and gold. No legacy, no victory, no comfort. But his death wasn't the death of a man. It was the slow, final breath of an idea. That power, like a family jewel, could be passed down untouched. That bloodlines meant destiny. With him, the Spanish branch of the House of Austria died. What remained wasn't glory, but warning. His autopsy horrified the doctors. A blackened heart, lungs filled with fluid, gangrenous intestines, atrophied testicles, blood thick like burnt oil. Not a corpse, a verdict. No sons to weep, no father to hold him. Only ambassadors scrambling before his body cooled, staking claims, drawing maps, readying armies. The War of Spanish Succession began before his soul had time to leave. A war that would tear Europe apart, redraw borders, and bury thousands beneath the greed of dynasties that still didn't understand they were already doomed. But the true horror wasn't the war. It was the decades before it, when millions believed a ruined body could still be king. That a twisted jaw, a fading mind, a broken soul could uphold divine order. They didn't believe because of faith. They believed out of fear. Because admitting Carlos was a genetic failure meant admitting the system was too. His portrait still hangs in museums. He looks noble, composed, serene, a king, a lie in oil. Beneath the canvas is the truth, a puppet, a mask, a ritual without a soul. He was never free, never allowed to choose. Born into a prison of blood and name. His life wasn't a tale of evil, it was a consequence, not a tyrant, not a villain. The final product of a power structure that valued name over merit, myth over science, lineage over humanity. And in that, Carlos becomes a mirror. He forces us to look not just at a dead dynasty, but at ourselves. At our leaders born of legacy, not worth. At our systems that cling to routine over reform. At our lies, repeated so often they become law. Carlos II left no monuments, no reforms, no progress, only warnings. A body sealed in gold. A crown that never fit. A dynasty that chose delusion over truth. That is his legacy. A portrait that doesn't flatter, but reveals. A tomb that doesn't honor, but reminds. A man who didn't symbolize greatness, but the cost of ignoring decay. Because his story doesn't end with death. What he represents still lives. In every structure too proud to change. In every tradition hiding from justice. In every system that values appearance over truth. Carlos didn't destroy his empire. The empire destroyed itself, and used his body as the excuse. For years, his decline was dressed up, his silence called wisdom, his pain masked by ceremony, parades, prayers, banquets, not for joy, but to sustain a lie so deep, even its creators believed it. And how many times in history have we done the same? Applauded broken leaders because of their name, allowed bloodlines and traditions to outweigh reason and compassion. Carlos II's story isn't just a royal tragedy. It's a dirty mirror reflecting our own fears, our fear of letting go. Because when a system is built on denial of science, of dignity, of truth, collapse isn't a risk, it's a certainty. Carlos was crowned a king, lived as a symbol, died as a warning. And the only question now is, how many more do we need before we finally listen to what history is already screaming? If this story moved you, share it. Comment below.